Assalamu alaikum. I received a question from Hussein, and I think you know who you are. MashaAllah, you post quite thoughtful comments usually on some of the posts that I put up regarding the relationship between science and Islam, especially when we speak about evolution. And I actually just came across your question here through Facebook. You sent it back end of December, actually, December 31st. And I thought I might as well use this opportunity to, first of all, say salam to you and just acknowledge that I got this email. And everybody that sends me messages, I do try to get through and read them all and respond as best as I can, but please be patient. There's quite a few of you that see some value in contacting me. At any rate, Hussein, I'm going to read your whole question just so that everybody gets an idea of what we're talking about here. Assalamu alaikum. I wanted to ask one question about this post you shared of the Isra and Mi'raj. It's been a while, so I don't remember, but anyways, there is one quote-unquote thoughtful response by a person, Hassan Muhammad, who says about the basic Islamic premise, creation out of nothing is logically impossible. You cannot casually act, I think you meant causally, act on something which has no properties to produce an effect, no matter how omnipotent you are. Everything that begins to exist comes from pre-existing material. I take it he's formally studying physics, so how would we approach this matter as far as you are concerned? I do have one very important overall question to ask, even though it is a little bit touchy, but inshallah it is fine. I see that you have very established views about the possibility of Adam alayhi salam having been the first man created directly by Allah without any preceding biological ancestors. And you mentioned this is exactly what science indubitably teaches. What I feel is that this person, and he's referring to Hassan Muhammad here, at a more basic level and despite a Muslim past, feels the same about the big question of whether God creates from nothing, and he will refer back to his formal study of physics to explain that he might be able to accept the possibility of God, yet only within certain parameters, such as impossibility of creating from nothing, etc. So the actual question is that how is delving into a given field really making people go into alternative explanations and sticking to them, quote unquote, no matter what Muslim scholars of the past may have said? I know I'm including you in a sense, but it is an issue that needs some discussion. And then he finishes off, or you finish off, Hussein, some clarifications on what I mentioned above. About the phrase, this is exactly what science indubitably teaches, I understand that you are saying that one cannot hold any scientific theory to be a good model and then make an exception for Adam alayhi salam, for example, since this is not the way science works. And when I use the term delving, I mean studying the science formally in a university setting. Anyway, the main question does remain. Okay, so let's first of all address a couple of points in this question. And everybody that's listening to this, what I try to do here, I'm actually not prepared. I just open up if I see a question that I think is a good one to record something on. This is the second reading of the question, and so I'm just going to go off the top of my head, and right now I'm just going, this is my thinking out loud basically. You mentioned that Hassan Muhammad said, creation out of nothing is logically impossible. Well, you cannot casually act on something which has no properties to produce an effect. Everything that begins to exist comes from pre-existing material. One thing about logic, quote-unquote logic, and how we and our reasoning, you'll notice that these statements are inductive statements based on previous experience of what you've observed. To say that you can't logically create out of nothing, the logic here is not, this statement is not exactly accurate. The logical impossibility is of having something bring itself into existence from non-existence. That is what is logically impossible. It is not logically impossible for an all-powerful, omnipotent being to bring something out of existence from non-existence. That's not impossible. If you want to know if something is impossible, logically speaking, you can think of, for example, it is logically impossible for a part to be bigger than the whole. To give you a more concrete example, it is logically impossible for a slice of pizza to be bigger than a whole pizza. That is logically impossible. You cannot conceptualize that even. It is logically possible, though, for you to travel forward in time and travel backwards in time. In fact, Hollywood makes movies about this. What is logically impossible and what is experientially, you haven't seen it, you haven't experienced it, impossible, they're two different things. So the more accurate thing to say here, or the accurate thing to say here, is it is logically impossible for something to have not existed and to bring itself into existence from non-existence. Because for something to bring itself into existence from non-existence, you're really saying that it existed before, it was present, and then it brought itself into existence from non-existence, but then you're saying it did not exist. You see how messed up the logic here is. So it is not logically impossible for the universe to not have existed before, and for God, who is ever present, who is pre-existent, to bring it into existence from non-existence. The word in Arabic, khalaqa, when you use khalaqa with regards to creation, you're making something come into existence from non-existence. Al-Khaliq is, with regards to God, means the creator, the one who brings something to existence from non-existence. When you attribute it to an individual, to a human being, you're saying that person is a liar because he is making up something that has no basis in reality. He's making a lie. He's forging a lie. So that's just the first point that I wanted to say about that. With regards to my position about Adam alayhi salam, I've talked about this several times before. There is no recording that I can make right now, and no small article that I can write right now that can suffice. This has to be a very lengthy treatise. It has to be a lengthy paper. It's probably going to be more like a book that I'm collecting the notes for right now, and it's very lengthy treatise to discuss because it brings in a lot of discussions. And what I would like to make very clear for anybody listening to this right now, very clear, I am not trying to reconcile the theory of evolution with the Quran. That is not the attempt here. I am also not saying that the theory of evolution is the final statement on everything. It is a model. I've said this before and I'll repeat it again. This is a working model that takes into account the current available evidence that we have in front of us. And when you put everything together according to scientific criteria and construct hypotheses from it and come up with theories and predictions and everything so far that we do in biology and evolutionary biology seems to confirm this model. And even when you bring in human beings into this model, it all adds up. Does that mean that this is the truth, that it describes reality as it was? That's not what we're saying. This really has to be understood. This is one of the biggest misconceptions about science in general and the theory of evolution itself. Don't get caught up with the Richard Dawkins of the world. These guys that scientism, the guys that look at science as the final arbiter of truth, that this is the final statement on everything, these guys, it's just history repeating itself. And I'll read just a little bit later from a book here that I definitely highly recommend people pick up because it clarifies a lot of things about this. So I think I've addressed, because a lot of your question was about God creating from nothing, and it's not impossible for God to create from nothing. What's impossible is for you to say that the universe was not there and then it brought itself into existence, like Lawrence Krauss. But what Lawrence Krauss is saying, and whenever cosmologists talk about the universe came into existence from nothing by itself, they're not talking about nothing in the real sense, that as in non-existence. They're talking about this, I believe, and I'm not going to delve into this matter because it's not my field, but I was made to understand that when they speak about nothing, they're really talking about energy equals zero. That when you take positive and negative, all the energy in total, when you add them up, you get zero energy. And that's the nothing they're talking about. But they're not talking about non-existence, something not being there at all. These are two different things. Okay, let's see what else we can talk about here from your question. Delving. Okay, and the last bit of your question, this is actually what I think you might find interesting. regarding how come people, when they study, they come up with alternative explanations when they're delving into a given field. When people delve into a given field, it makes them go into alternative explanations. And I'll use something, I can't remember what he calls it, but Michel Foucault has a concept, and the concept is regarding the social structure or the general structure that makes up a field. When people are within that structure, they assume the assumptions and the presumptions of that structure, and they just operate within it. So, for example, if you look at social causes, social justice causes, when you look at actually, there's an example. This happened to me just a little while ago. I mentioned when Beyonce released her song Formation. When she released her song Formation, I looked up the lyrics, and I just posted the lyrics up on my Twitter, and I had no idea that this was going to get me the wrath of the beehive. I mean, Beyonce fans and fanatics. I've never had such a Twitter storm attacks on my mentions, because all I said was, I commented on a couple of the words in her lyrics. I wasn't interested in the video. I was interested in the message that she's saying. And the message was, aside from talking about black pride and the nose and the skin and the hair and all of these things, she mentioned, like, you're a black Bill Gates in the making. And I mentioned one thing, and I said, so capitalism is a way for black people to rise up. And I just made that comment, and people just came out and said, yes, we need to come up with we need to have resources, we need to do this. But the thing is, bro, capitalism, the very structure that you're in, that you look up to, I mean, Bill Gates himself, look at the projects that he supports and the projects that he's into. Don't look at the things that you think he's being a philanthropist about. Bill Gates and the structure that he operates within is, in its root, the very structure itself oppresses black people and the down and out and the downtrodden in America and all over the world. In fact, capitalism itself is a problem. The way that it's this free-run capitalism that has no regulation, that basically makes the rich richer and the poor poorer. It oppresses the people that are at the bottom. I mean, if you look at the structure itself, but the thing is, you had a lot of black people, black brothers and sisters in the U.S. come up, and they just couldn't see beyond that. When you're within that structure where you cannot even step out and attack the very foundations of it and say this very structure is problematic, your activism within it is limited activism. You look at also a book, I can't remember the author's name, but I just read just the first bit of it, The New Jim Crow. She's a lawyer, I believe, in California. And she attacked, in this book, I just read the first intro bit of it, and it's quite shocking because she's talking at the very structure of the criminal justice system in America. It's one thing to go and try to eradicate crime from black communities and work on that, and work on education and these things, but the very structure of the criminal justice, so-called justice system in America, is set up in such a way, apparently, that blacks in America are going to be targeted at an extraordinary rate. And they will get longer sentences. They will be persecuted for crimes that whites won't be prosecuted for. They lose their voting rights if they have a criminal record. So now they can't even participate in the democratic system. I mean, it's just a long list of problems. And so if you try to get your activism to function within that system, now you got a problem. So why am I bringing that as an example? When you say people studying in university science, what a lot of students don't realize, and I'm starting to really grasp that now as I teach undergraduate students, there are a lot of philosophical foundations. There's a quote by Daniel Dennett, and he says, and he basically says, there is no philosophy-free science. There is science where the philosophical baggage hasn't been worked out. And that's really what we're dealing with here. A lot of people study science, especially the undergrads, and if they don't really become aware of it, they go into grad school and they become more entrenched and more dogmatic about it because they become indoctrinated by a philosophical system in Western education that basically turns you into an atheist without you even realizing it. That's really what's going on, because the system indoctrinates you in a way that you become a materialist and you don't even acknowledge this. Now, there's a book I'm going to read you some passages from, just a few passages, by Earl McCormick. And Earl McCormack was a philosopher who published this book by Duke University Press in 1976. And this book is titled Metaphor and Myth in Science and Religion. And I'm just going to read you some passages from the intro. I mean, the rest of the book is just working through and explaining these points at much greater detail. But I'm just going to read you some things for you to really grasp this. By accepting a theoretical description, and so now think about the theory of evolution, think about theoretical physics, think about all of these things, even when they give you data and facts. By accepting a theoretical description as a literal one, men have over and over again transformed a speculative and hypothetical understanding into a myth. Those who became so convinced by the explanatory power of Newtonian mechanics that they came to believe that the world actually was composed of corpuscular particles located at spatio-temporal points, removed Newton's view of the physical world from the status of a tentative theory and transformed it into a myth. And only when Einstein's relativity theory offered an alternative to the Newtonian view did many scientists realize that they had wrongly claimed finality for the earlier theory. From the perspective of later theories, it becomes easy to see that earlier theories are inadequate. Yet the lesson that one ought not to attribute reality to these theories seems to come hard. Through familiarity with the theory and with the accumulation of large numbers of confirmations, researchers often come to believe that things really are the way that the theory suggests they are. By such assents, however, we forget the tentative nature of the theory and the hypothetical nature of the root metaphor upon which it rests and create a myth. And then he goes on a little bit later to say, contemporary scientists know, after having lived through several revolutions in scientific theory, that any theory is necessarily hypothetical and possibly may be superseded in the future by a different and more comprehensive theory. Myths are always discovered in retrospect when a later theory supplants an earlier one. Myths are to be avoided, for they often inhibit the consideration of new hypotheses. By avoiding myths, we do not wish to eliminate the contents of those myths, for their contents are the speculative hypotheses that may yield genuine insights into the nature of the empirical world or of human experience. What we want to avoid is the trap of committing oneself to a theoretical explanation as the absolute and final description of reality. And then I'm going to finish off maybe with just one more passage here. Traditional myths about the world associated ideas, but they often did seek confirmation in empirical events. Ritual ceremonies conducted to bring about fertility were judged by results, and if no rain came, attention was given to the ceremony itself to see if it had been faulty. Occasionally, after repeated failure, a different ceremony based upon a different set of beliefs was employed. More often, when failure came and no imperfections could be found in the ceremony, it was continued in spite of these negative results. Such procedures are very similar to the response of modern scientists who, when confronted with unexpected negative results, first check their experimental apparatus, and if they find no faults, seldom abandon their theory unless another more comprehensive theory that can account for those negative results has already been proposed. Both the primitive man and the modern scientists create myths by believing that their explanation of the nature of the world is the absolute and final one. Myth results from the mistaken attribution of reality to a hypothetical description. Modern man, with his confidence that his explanations are so superior to primitive ones, faces the additional temptation of believing that since he is so much more rational, his theories cannot become myths. I mean, this is just, it's one of those things that when you go through these texts, and I definitely recommend, this is one of those books that I pick up when I go to used bookstores. Books that you don't find at Barnes and Nobles and Chapters and all these places. Just go to the used bookstores, go into the philosophy sections and pick up these books that are just gems. The reason I read this out to you is to bring home a point. There is an undeserved certainty and belief in scientific knowledge that takes it into a theological domain that I've repeatedly warned against. When I speak about the theory of evolution, when we talk about this model that describes how life on Earth functions, people talk about it arose and it came. It doesn't explain life in the metaphysical sense, because if you look at a dead creature, you can explain the reasons why it's not alive, it's not living. The heart stopped, the brain stopped, whatever. You can come up with any explanation you come up with. But at the end of the day, what animated this creature before it fell dead? What was the animating force? Life. That is beyond the realm of physical explanations, which is something that a lot of scientists don't like to accept. A lot of materialists will be very reluctant to even go along with. You'll find, if you really can work out the underpinnings of some of the theories they talk about, you'll see a lot of equivocation. By equivocation, I mean they use a word in one sense, intending it to mean something other than what they actually are operating within. So when I say about accept the theory of evolution, I don't mean you have to believe it. In fact, if you have that type of belief in science, you're not really a scientist. You're someone who's now delved into a dogmatic view of what this is and don't understand how science functions, which is the problem with the Richard Dawkins type of the world. If you're really a genuine scientist who's in search of understanding how nature works and such, you would just recognize, first of all, the limitations of your own intellect. I mean, I saw this... There was this stat I read a while back, and I think it was from the U.S. Department of Environment or one of these ministries regarding environment and wildlife and what, I don't know what it's called, but anyways, they had an interesting stat. I believe the stat was 85% of life on the planet Earth is in the ocean. And of the ocean, we have only explored less than 5% of it. So think about that. 85% of life is in the ocean, and we've only explored 5% of the ocean. Yet, we have this theory that supposedly explains how life works on all of Earth throughout all of time, and our data is based on very small amount. Our explanation is based on a very small amount of data. I would say humble yourself a little bit, because I would not be surprised. In fact, I expect 200 years from now, or 500 years from now, people to come through and to have different theories, different explanations that may have nothing to do at all with what we have right now in modern times. And in fact, they would look back at us in the same way that we look back at people 500 years ago. The scholastics, for example, 500 years ago, that paid so much homage to Aristotle and Plato and all of these guys from 2,000 years ago. And they were so dogmatically adherent to their tradition that they did not want... In fact, people were burnt at the stake. People were... it's almost religious fervor in nature, if you think about it, how they were adhering to these views. So all of these discussions about science, I don't know, from... me as a scientist, someone who has done research, someone who was in the lab and is looking to get back in the lab again now that I'm starting to teach. I look at all of these discussions and I shake my head. And when I speak to fellow scientists, Muslims who are practicing Muslims, and even non-practicing Muslims, but who understand what science is really about, we all shake our head and kind of wonder, like, what's going on with all of these. What's really happening is that we have popularizers of science who are atheistic, who are atheists, most of them, that due to the human drive to have supernatural explanations, have taken supernatural view of science. And science is supposed to be a natural thing. It's supposed to be about nature, not about the supernatural. And so I don't know. My recommendation with all of this stuff is go through it. Try to come up with the theories, study a little bit on the philosophy of science, but also, if you can manage, Go and actually attend some of the lab meetings and research meetings that scientists engage in. You will notice, and all the scientists out there that would listen to this would definitely agree with me, even if they are total materialist, physicalist, atheists, don't believe in anything beyond this, they will still agree with me that the discussions that happen in the lab with regards to research and the conclusions that are drawn from the research studies, they're nowhere near what is reported in the public sphere. The way that pop culture spreads scientific studies is quite an insult, and it's laughable. That's not to mention all the issues with regards to replicability problems, and the replication problem is not just in psychology, it's also in hard sciences, where you just hear about the study, but you don't hear about the refutations of the study. You don't even hear sometimes about the fact that the study was pulled because of faulty data, if there was some crisis with it. I mean, and that's not to mention also the crisis within the publishing industry itself, that they all look for positive results, but nobody is able to, very few people are able to publish null findings, which is actually what happens most of the time. You do the study and you come up with null findings, and then what do we do in the lab? Anybody that's actually in the lab will tell you, we just go on and try to do another experiment and we publish significant findings that we think are exciting. And then we hope that someone replicates it down the road, and then we move on. So the way that we view science versus the way the public views science are two different things. And I'll close off with one thing. I don't want this to come across as totally shaking the foundations of belief in science, or for it to even come across as, well, how come you speak about evolution in the way that you do, or how come you have this trust in science the way that you do? There are two Qur'ans. There's the Qur'an that was revealed upon the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, which we have, but there's also the Qur'an what's called the Qur'an al-Mashhud. This is the witnessed Qur'an, which is the creation of God. If I'm going to investigate the creation of God and come up with, and it's not a random creation. I mean, if you go out there and if it was truly random and you could not predict how things are going to go about, you wouldn't be able to live. There are certain patterns in nature. There are certain things that we can deduce and derive from nature. And so when you investigate these things and you come up with hypotheses about them, and your experimentations are correct, and you replicate the studies and you come up with the similar finding, and then someone across the globe does the same experiment and comes up with a similar finding, and there is some weight to that. There is some level of validity to that finding. That's not to say that you believe it theologically, but that's just to say that you accept what you come up with, and you just trust that your intellectual powers, through which you are in Islam, are obligated. I mean, someone who doesn't have the intellect is no longer legally bound by the Sharia if you don't have your intellectual powers. And secondly, it's through this intellect that I believe in God. I mean, if I don't trust my intellect, then I shouldn't trust any conclusions that it comes up with, one of which is that God exists. That's through pure reason. So using my reason as a judge over my findings, I come up with explanations, and these seem to pan out and they work. And not everything in science, when we talk about the revolutions in scientific theories, one misconception is that we think that the whole scientific establishment will be uprooted and everything, absolutely everything, will be changed and we'll have a brand new thing. That's not how it works. Some things remain. Some things are sustainable. Other things are not. And at the end of the day, recognize the limitations of the human intellect, recognize the limitations of our findings. There's nothing wrong with saying that, well, so far this theory seems, or this model, of whatever model that you're talking about, seems to confirm, the experiments seem to confirm it, and so we're just going to keep it on. Don't try to reconcile. I mean, this relationship between science and religion, do not try to reconcile between the two. What you can try to do is you can approach the Qur'an, first of all, by dropping the baggage that you have. Don't impose upon the Qur'an or upon Islam things that you are not certain about. A lot of us come into Islam, and that includes even some of the teachers and scholars and preachers. They come with their own baggage, and they end up making some claims about the tradition that, frankly, are not sustainable. I mean, people have written about this. There's a book, for example, and I mentioned this before, but there's an Azhari scholar. He wrote a book called Al-Isra'iliyat wal-Mawdu'at في كتب التفسير. The Israelite narrations and the fabricated hadiths that have been included in the books of tafsir, the books which we use for interpretation of the Quran. So this is a very vast science, and a lot of the things that people have beliefs about regarding creation, when you look at the Quran, I mean, the one unequivocal thing you can say about creation in the Quran is that God commanded you to go and investigate it. That's the one unequivocal, indisputable, indubitable fact that you can say about the Quran, is that your Lord who revealed this Quran said, go out there and look at what I did. But to turn the Quran into a book of science, I think is a problem. I have an interview with Sheikh Saeed Foda. It's published with the Medina Institute. You guys can look at it. Part 2 of it is talking about the relationship between science and the Quran. And from my conversation with him, he was very weary of all of these attempts not to... I mean, some people have misinterpreted what he said, what was said by him. They said that you can't use science to do tafsir of the Quran. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, don't turn the Quran into a book of science. Allah did not challenge you on a scientific basis. So, if science tells you something, don't try to make reconciliations or anything. You may come up with certain insights that may be valid for you, and as long as they obey the language and you're not going beyond the limits or whatever, that's fine. But to turn the Quran into a book of science and assume that it tells you things about nature in the scientific detail that some people are presuming it to be, and thus turning an industry of the so-called scientific miracles of the Quran, or coming up with certain unequivocal statements about how Adam alayhi salam was created. I really, the more I look into it, the more convinced I become that what some people are saying about the creation of Adam alayhi salam and the specific details that they derive, that they assume happened, they're not there. I don't see them in the Quran. I mean, Allah says certain things about the creation of Adam alayhi salam, but to come up with an elaborate story about the creation of Adam alayhi salam that completely takes away scientific inquiry or scientific findings that we have available and models that we've constructed, and turns people that accept them into heretics, I really don't see how that works. Not to mention the fact that when it comes to Aqeedah, at least from an Ash'ari Maturidi perspective, the only things that you have to take into Aqeedah are things that are qat'i mutawatir. So you would have to take things that are multiple transmissions if it's a hadith. So you can't take a had, solitary transmitted hadith into your Aqeedah that you have to now obligate people to believe in, that if they don't, they're out of Islam. And secondly, qat'i, that there is no other interpretation, there is no other way about it. And if you look at what the Mufassirun, the scholars of tafsir, have said about specifically the creation of Adam alayhi salam, the public has one narrative, but if you really delve into the books of tafsir, you don't find that unequivocal narrative perpetrated by absolutely everybody. There are major scholars that have said different things about it regarding where Adam alayhi salam and Hawa alayhi salam were, regarding how they were created, whether there was something before them or not. I mean, there's discussions about this, but you don't hear about it because some people are just simpleton about it. At any rate, I hope this was not too all over the place. It is quite late for me in the evening as I record this, but hopefully it provides some answers for you. And yeah, I really hope that in the future, I don't know what it is now when I put in Muhammad Ghailan on the internet, not that I look myself up, but when I just look for certain things I've published, Google immediately puts up evolution, as if I'm like the only guy that's talking about evolution. Subhanallah. So I'm going to try to avoid this subject for the next little while. I know some of you will insist on asking questions. I do see them. I may come back to it later on at some point, but I really would like to address other questions than this one. Hopefully this one was a mixture of both science and evolution. At least it's not all about evolution, and maybe it helps address some of the issues that are being raised by your question. So, Jazakallah khair, Hussein. Sorry that I don't reply to everything you write. Again, I do read it, but it's just time constraints. At any rate, I hope you guys keep me in your dua. Wassalamu alaikum.